So let me ask you a couple of questions about the Shem Tov. We have a quote from Papias or Papias. He is reported to have said, I think Eusebius quotes him in the 4th century. So he said, Papias, that Matthew compiled the oracles in a Hebrew dialect, and each one translated as he was able, Matthew. Is it possible that by the oracles, which is the Greek logia or logia, Papias meant something else? For the Greek
It's
word
definitely.
logia was also used by Clement, as you
Mhm.
probably know, to refer to the words of the Hebrew scriptures, cited by Matthew many times, obviously, or even to later what some call spurious gospels from a group called the Ebionites and the Nazarenes.
First of all, anything's possible. So if you say something, ask if it's possible. You know, it. Yeah, it's possible. I'm a butterfly dreaming I'm on a podcast, right? I don't. I need what? I need evidence for that.
Is Clement evidence for the alternate use of the word logia?
Absolutely. So the
Okay.
standard explanation in mainstream scholarship is that the logia that Papias is talking about is actually a collection of sayings similar to the Gospel of Thomas, where it's only sayings without stories, and that this was a Hebrew or possibly Aramaic source to the Gospels in general, right? Not that it was Q, but it was something like a Q, that it was this Hebrew collection of sources. That's not how Eusebius understands it. Eusebius, who is giving us a citation of Papias, and he has the broader context, which we don't have, unfortunately, he understands this as the Gospel of Matthew. Is it the Gospel of Matthew? Could be. I think it is, but you're right. There are other possibilities. I acknowledge that.
Is it only Matthew who you believe was originally written in Hebrew or other gospels?
I would say the best evidence is from Matthew.
There
Um,
is no evidence for the others?
I wouldn't say there's no evidence. No, I would say Mark and Luke have, at the very least, Hebrew sources.
As you probably know, most New Testament scholars have found that overall, the New
Yeah.
Testament writers preferred the Septuagint.
Is that really true overall?
I've heard 60% up to 70% of the references, citations they have found. Well, as a matter of fact, I'll give you Allen and Allen, Greek lexicographers. They say that the quote, the fact that from the first, all New Testament writings were written, all New Testament writings were written in Greek is conclusively demonstrated by their citations from the Old Testament, which are from the Septuagint, end quote. So that's Allen and Allen. You can take it or leave it. Matthew, of course, follows this trend of using the old Greek, the Septuagint, with up to a dozen, as you know, or so references to the Septuagint. For example, as you know, the most famous one in Matthew 123, where he quotes from the Isaiah 7:14 verse, and there's this whole debate about the word virgin there.
So the issue you're bringing up is the New Testament citing the Old Testament. And my understanding is there's three types of quotations. There are quotations where it matches the Masoretic text against the Septuagint. There's citations where it matches the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. And then there are citations which don't match either. For example, at the end of, I think it's Matthew 2, the verse about being a Nazarene, which doesn't appear in the Masoretic text or the Septuagint, and may refer to some other form of the text that we don't have anymore. This was actually an issue that Christians acknowledged in the Middle Ages. In the 8th century, there was this bishop in Iraq called Timotheus, and he wrote a letter that survived to his colleague in Israel. And he says, I heard that the Jews found these scrolls near Jericho in caves. Can you check in those scrolls to see if their scriptures match our citations of the Old Testament? Because we don't find these in our version of the Old Testament. So this is something that not something we just discovered last week.
So my question is, if we both agree at least half of the time,
Okay.
50%, right?
Yeah.
Matthew is using the Septuagint. Why would he do that at all if it's originally a Hebrew?
So one possibility is, so first of all, let's start with what George Howard actually argued. George Howard argued that he pointed to Josephus, who tells us that he wrote his, I believe it was Antiquities, but it could have been the Jewish war, I don't recall. That he wrote the book in Hebrew, and some people translate the word Hebrew as Aramaic, but let's not get into that for this purpose. That he wrote it in Hebrew, and then he had an assistant help him translate it. And I've been told by Greek scholars that the Greek of Josephus is a very, very awkward Greek. If you're a classical Greek scholar, it's a very strange Greek. It's kind of hard to understand even. I'm not an expert in that. That's what I've been told. Howard's argument in his 1987 book, Gospel of Matthew According to a Primitive Hebrew Text, is that Matthew did a very similar thing to Josephus. He wrote it in Hebrew, and that he then translated it himself into Greek. Is that possible? Do you think that's possible?
It's highly unlikely to me because
Okay.
it is said that Matthew reproduces approximately 90% of Mark's Greek text. Some scholars say that Matthew even edits the Greek of Mark's gospel to even improve Mark's use of the Greek syntax. Have you heard that or read about?
So what you're asking here is the question of Mark and primacy,
right?
And as I'm sure you do know, that there are different approaches to the relationship between the synoptic gospels. Some scholars who have nothing to do with the Hebrew study, the mainstream view is Mark and primacy. That is, Mark and Luke copied from Mark as one of their sources, and their other source was Q.
Right. Because that's all they have, right? The Greek. So that's why they're relying on that.
It's definitely a possibility.
Right.
And look, this is something George Howard said all those years ago.
Sure.
He said this has to make us rethink the whole question of the synoptic problem, right?
Do you know, Nehemia, how many copies of Matthew have been found, or scraps? You know, they add them all up.
So of the Shem of Matthew, there's 28 manuscripts. There's different versions of Matthew in Hebrew, but all of those so far, to me at least, seem to be definitive translations.
I was talking about the Greek Matthew.
Oh, the Greek. How many are in the Greek?
Do you know how many copies of the Greek?
I'm guessing if you include lectionaries, it's over 5,000.
Okay, so there are thousands of copies and scraps, right, of Matthew. And so do you believe they are all Greek translations? The earliest I saw was 150 AD. Do you believe that thousands and all those thousands they're all Greek translations?
Well, you would only need one translation, right?
Okay.
Meaning the first time it's translated, all those are you'll agree all those are copies of a single text, right?
Sure.
Well, yeah, all of those would be copied from that translation, wouldn't
Yeah, my question was about the transmission, the history of the transmission. So we have 150 AD to the 1300s when we get the Shem Tov. Right. So we don't have, as far as I know, you might know.
No, you're right, we don't.
So that's my question, that we have thousands and thousands, maybe 5,000, maybe more. Why is the Hebrew Matthew such a short-lived sort of phenomenon? For example, it seems to have disappeared as quickly as it arrived.
You are right, however, as far as I know, there's a big silent period from around the time of Jerome up until the 14th century. Okay. That's 1,000 years where we don't have any references to it or a manuscript.
Can you help our audience out? Are there any other linguists or grammarians who agree with the, it's called, by the way, also the Proto-Matthew hypothesis. Are there any other people, linguists or grammarians people can research this with?
I mean, they can look online. As far as I know, the mainstream scholars don't accept it.
Okay.
Howard put out this proposition in the 80s. There was a series of responses from one particular scholar who wasn't even a Hebrew scholar. I forget what his name was. And it's kind of late, it's really been ignored by most scholars. I would love for some scholars who are Hebrew experts to prove it wrong, and maybe they can, right?
So why do you think linguists, grammarians don't engage if there is a serious debate and research to be had? Maybe because they're so late in the transmission process?
That could be. That's a possibility of why they ignore it.